This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, January 14th, 1864. Let's go to Kankakee, Illinois, where a woman by the name of Elizabeth Packard is on trial, claiming that she suffered imprisonment and abuse by her husband in their own house. We'll get to the roots of their fallout, but the trial ended up being about more than just her relationship with her husband, but this larger question of her sanity. Witnesses came forward to argue that Packard was mentally unstable. Others lauded her for being of right mind, just being outspoken at a moment when women were not expected to be as outspoken as she had been. The Packard trial tells us a lot about how women were treated in that era, especially women who dared speak up and act, quote, unladylike, or ones who dared to fight for larger rights. There is a book out from Simon & Schuster called Unbecoming a Lady, The Forgotten Sluts and Shrews That Shaped America. It is written by Therese O'Neill, who's a New York Times bestselling author, has written a number of books that highlight unspoken heroes like this. But Therese, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll get to maybe some of the other stories from your book, but thanks for focusing in on Elizabeth Packard with us.
She deserves our time.
There
She's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, here as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Elizabeth Packard is claiming that she has suffered imprisonment and abuse. Do you want to give us a sketch of what the relationship between her and her husband was like? And then we'll get a little into what takes place in this trial and kind of how it ties into this much bigger conversation.
Yeah, by all intents and purposes, she was happily married to her husband, named, I believe it's going to be pronounced Theophilus, because that comes off the tongue best, as
Great
Theophilus.
historical name, Theophilus.
Yeah, they were a happily married couple, and they were both pretty well educated. She was really well educated for a woman in her day. She'd been to seminary, and he was a Calvinist minister, which is kind of, for our purposes here, kind of interchangeable with Presbyterianism. And they were doing just fine for so long, and then one day they had would have a lot of guests over to the house, and they talk about religion all the time, and she'd listen astutely while raising the family and doing all the wifely things you need to do in that century. And she just started asking questions about their doctrine. And one day she kind of just said, "I'm not sure that I want to be a Presbyterian anymore." And he was a leading minister of that faith in his community. He's like, well, that simply won't do. And that's when the trouble started.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like a huge transgression that a woman would say.
Oh, you're so wrong, Niki.
Well, to modern ears, it might not sound like a huge transgression, but she was forceful about it. She didn't just, one time say, I don't know if that's right.
She was adamant. She didn't take out a newspaper ad yet to say so. She just said, she's a minister's wife, and the church was the center of their community. And she's like, but what about this? And that simply, it was messing up his flow, and it couldn't stand. So he took action, and it's almost so ridiculous it's funny. And because I'm of the belief that you need to laugh so you don't cry sometimes when it comes to history. Well, I'll tell you how it went. She woke up one morning, and before she even had her clothes on, and remember, this is like 1860 something, so she's a Victorian lady, and so having your nightdress on, you might as well be naked. And her bedroom door flew open, and in came her husband Theophilus and two doctors. Now, this is a time where to be a doctor, you just need to be able to write the word doctor in front of your name. Came into her room. They were both members of his congregation, and they examined her for sanity. They did this by taking her pulse, which was rapid because two strange men and one really strange man had just barged into her bedroom and started touching her. And then they asked her some questions, which I actually wrote down because they were brought up at her trial, and they are great questions. And then they scooped her up, put her on a chair, hoisted the chair, took her down to the railway station on the chair, and sent her to the insane asylum and locked her in. And that was that. That was it. That was it.
I mean, again, this just sounds so utterly appalling.
Even for the day. It was appalling. That's why some action was taken. It was a little too much.
Yeah,
but it was legal. It was actually honestly written into I have the statute of the state they were living in. Married women who are evidently insane or distracted may be detained in the hospital on the request of the husband without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. Done and done. It was legal.
Wow.
It was in the
So
books.
there's even an acknowledgement there, though, that the standard is different in that.
Yeah, other people might actually have to prove it. But if in this case, if your husband says, look, I live with her, she's nuts, done and done.
Wow. And this is where we might introduce to our listeners the idea of coverture, which is this basically legal doctrine that was in some ways in place in the United States through the 1970s or the 1990s, which basically said that a woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. And so her rights are sort of subsumed to him. And this law is such a perfect example of that because the husband gets to decide whether she gets institutionalized. She's institutionalized in 1860, and she is there for 3 years, constantly being asked, like, are you a Calvinist? And when she would say no, they would be like, still insane. And I'm curious how she used that time, those 3 years that she's functionally imprisoned in this asylum.
She did a lot of writing. She did. But that was all she could do. It didn't really do her any good, though, because her letters were all intercepted. She was allowed to study her Bible and suitable religious tracts that were probably Calvinist. But inside her own brain, where she was still kind of free and not completely crazy, she got to thinking. And I think that time in that seclusion informed a lot of what came next. Because after those 3 years, the hospital, Theophilus didn't want her back. But the hospital said, we can't cure her because she still doesn't want to be a Presbyterian Calvinist. And so they sent her home. He's like, well, I am a 19th century husband who has been burdened with this insane wife. So what do we do according to all the Gothic novels? Well, we lock her in a room, lock the door from the outside, and leave her there. And it's really important that he did that because for some reason, that's illegal. That was legal kidnapping. So that's when the story shifted.
So before we get to the trial and the twists and turns there, I want to ask you and get people's thoughts on one other question, which is, the initial incident where her husband claims she's gone insane and she's locked up. Was that because she had dared to question the church, or was that because she had dared to question her husband?
Oh, gosh. Her husband, totally.
Yeah.
He was the church. And she was making him look the fool. He was in charge of this, teaching this particular message to the people. And if he couldn't control his own wife, as God is to control the church, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible about the husband is to the wife as Christ is to the body of the church. Well, then he's obviously failing. And that can't stand. That's his whole life. Her questioning him was an insult to God.
Well, because from my perspective, he sounds like the crazy one. But,
Like a total douche canoe, right? Theophilus was terrible.
Yeah.
But it all came out good in the end. Well, as good as it could.
Well, and it all comes out in the trial, right? And I guess the trial is helped by the fact that she has written so much. She spent 3 years documenting what's happened to her.
Yes, she did document stuff in her diaries and journals. They didn't take it away. The authority said, well, locking her up in the hospital, that's okie dokie. Who wouldn't? But you can't keep her imprisoned in the house. That's official kidnapping. So she was freed. And that's when she brought charges against her husband that she had been wrongfully imprisoned. And they went to trial. And the trial was so wonderful. The fact she got one, she found somebody to represent her. But then because they called the witnesses to the stand who'd had her incarcerated, the two doctors, and their testimony was so freaking funny. I mean, dark funny.
So what made that testimony funny?
Okay, so the two main witnesses were the doctors Doctors Dole and Doctors Brown, okay? Both parishioners of Theophilus. And they gave their... Can I read you some of the testimony from
Please.
Dr. Brown? Because it's fantastic. Her lawyer said, so tell us what made you sure that she was mentally incapacitated. And he gave a list. And he said, one reason, she disliked to be called insane. End of sentence.
Wow.
And number 2, she had an incoherency of thought. She failed to illuminate me with light when she talked about God. Which I think is a pretty high standard for any woman. But
Yeah.
the third one, again, she had an aversion to being called insane.
Wow.
Number 4 was her belief that to call her insane was to abuse her and blaspheme the Holy Ghost. Well, her belief that some calamity would befall her owing to my being there, and her refusal to shake my hand when I left. I think that was just her reading the room.
Yeah, no kidding.
Remarkable. But there were witnesses on the other side as well, right? I mean, there were people who were sticking up for her, seems like.
Oh, there were tons of people that spoke of her character and her sense. You know, but it was all about character witnesses.
Mm.
Folks, I have very good news to deliver right at the top of the new year. That's right, it is 2025 and the great Alex Goldman is back with a new podcast called Hyperfixed right here on Radiotopia. Isn't it nice to get good news to start a new year? You know Alex, right? You know Alex. I've actually known Alex for a long time, going all the way back to when we were at WNYC together. He worked on the media, I worked in the newsroom. He went on to make the legendary and much beloved podcast Reply All, and now all is right with the universe because Alex is back with a new show on Radiotopia. Some things just make sense. So, what is Hyperfixed? Well, it's a show in which Alex and his team try to solve problems for their listeners. No problem too big, no problem too small. What's that mysterious button do? Why do the big coolers at grocery stores not have doors on them? Should I have kids or not? Along the way to answering these questions, Alex takes you on a journey to uncover the hidden systems and rabbit holes that help explain how we got here. And if you know Alex's work, you can rest assured that there is some vintage Goldman grumpiness along the way. Seriously, when we say that Radiotopia is the home for the most original audio makers in the world to try their ambitious new projects, this is what we are talking about. So, help welcome Alex Goldman to Radiotopia. Rejoice in an excellent new show to add to your rotation. It's called Hyperfixed. Hyperfixed. Check it out right now, wherever you get your podcasts.
This did seem like a straightforward case. You have on the one hand these witnesses against her that are like, well, she disagreed with her husband and she didn't like being called insane. And then on the other hand, you have these character witnesses from the community, including a doctor. So the final witness was Dr. Duncanson. And he sums it up pretty well. He said, I do not call people insane because they differ with me. I pronounce her a sane woman and wish we had a nation of such women, which is quite the character testimony. And I think that when that gets thrown to the jury, when it's like, is it these guys talking about that she doesn't like being called insane? Or is it this doctor who sees her as an upstanding citizen? The jury makes a pretty quick call on that.
Because does anybody like being called
that in
insane?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a
So
really
what
good
happens
point.
then when the jury goes to deliberate here? Kelly, their verdict is pretty fast, huh?
Yeah. I mean, within minutes, you know, they, I guess you could say, acquit her. She gets acquitted. I mean, it's,
But it's 7 minutes. At least get to order the free lunch. This is what I'm saying. Even if you know what you're going to get, you're there, like, you know,
But what is so, enraging, I think, after this is that once she's free to go, once she returns home, you know, her husband clearly saw the writing on the wall because he took everything. He took the children. He took all of her papers. He took all of her belongings. Yeah. He took everything.
So,
he left.
while the jury was in their quick deliberation, I guess there was a little bit of time before she was actually released. Yeah. He went home. He had sold the house, which was bought with her dowry. He had packed everything up, and he'd taken the children, and he'd left the state. Wow. He was gone. And she had no home to go to. And that wasn't the end of her trouble, because she still belonged to him. It was still the 1860s, and she was still his wife.
They weren't divorced, yeah.
And the thing that's even more fascinating is that she did not want a divorce. If she'd been a divorced woman, she would have gotten autonomy back. But she also would have had what was to her a terrific stigma of divorce, and she'd already undergone a lot of stigma, and she was sick of it.
Yeah. So,
and she didn't. She's like, and they said, if you just, she's like, well, I want my rights, and they said, well, then get divorced, and she said, but what have I done to deserve a divorce? I don't want a divorce, but we can't judge today by the standards of yesterday or the mentality of yesterday, and to her, divorce was more of a
stigma,
a punishment than. It was just a further increase of punishment and loss of status. She said, I've been a good wife, so I shouldn't be divorced. I've committed no adultery. The things that God says result in divorce, I haven't done that. So she never sought a divorce, though they never shared a roof again.
What I find so remarkable is that she goes through this pretty harrowing ordeal. She's been kept against her will, both in this asylum and then in her own home. Her husband sold the house, took everything, took her children, who she had no custody rights to.
Yeah.
And she then dedicates herself to helping other people in her situation and calling attention to the abuses of the asylum system. And so she is going around the country advocating for laws so that people can't do this anymore. You read from that enraging Illinois law that said that men could just lock their wives up. And she went around and changed the law in places like Illinois, in states all around the country, to improve the care for the mentally ill and then also to restore rights to people put into asylums.
And to do that, this is something that in 2025 we probably don't think about so much, but to do that, she had to air the most private dirty laundry, which you did not do in the 1800s. She had to say, this is the horrible thing that happened to me. We do that now, and everyone's like, dude, that's terrible. Me too. But back then, you didn't do that. Everything was peachy keen or you were a failure. She got blamed for being the kind of wife who ended up in this situation. She's like, I don't care. I gotta talk. And she did. She did speeches all over the country. She wrote and wrote and wrote books and papers. This is my great indignity. This is why it happened. This is what I've suffered. And, they all, even her kids had to bear the brunt of being that family, those weirdos. But she had to do it, and she did. Yeah. And the end result was pretty impressive.
If there's a silver lining to this story at all, it's that she doesn't just sort of stop and say, well, woe is me. She really takes to the streets, publishes these books she makes money off of, books that she's able to
she made enough money
herself.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, to support herself and her kids.
Yeah.
As a writer,
yes,
and a public speaker,
yes, and bought a house.
Almost as hard. It's almost as hard to do back then as it is today.
Yeah. To be able to buy a house, to be able to establish yourself, and equally important, to be able to change the law where no one could be committed to an insane asylum unless they had a jury that agreed that should be the case. You had to be presented essentially before your peers, before your community, to have them say, "Oh yes, we agree."
Yeah. And those laws were copied in lots of other states as she was advocating for them.
She got the Act for the Protection of Personal Liberty that guaranteed everyone accused of insanity, including married women, a jury trial. Packard is credited with influencing 34 bills in various state legislatures, as well as success on the national stage, including the 1875 law allowing asylum inmates to have mail access. 1875, asylum inmates were finally allowed mail access. She did all this. And in fact, a cool side note is her law, the laws she forced to come to light, they were part of the trial of Mary Todd Lincoln in 1875.
Fascinating.
Mary Todd Lincoln had a legal trial where they found her insane, and maybe that wasn't fair, but still, it was a step forward.
Yeah.
She got a legal trial to prove she was insane and to be committed.
That's major.
And maybe she was. She had a hard life, Mary Todd.
Yeah, poor thing. No, that's major. And I don't think we realize how much of, it goes back to sort of the quote that you read, Niki, about like the doctor saying we need more women like this that will not just champion for their own lives, but for the lives of all women and all people that find themselves in such terrible circumstances. And I do love that, at the sort of end of her life, she doesn't die until years later, but like she's able to have what was lost restored to her. She's able to have her children come back to live with her. They're teenagers at this point, but she's still able.
Her youngest were teens.
Yeah, she's still able to get her children back.
She missed a lot. I'm a mom, and that really bothers me. Yeah. She was a hands-on mom. I don't even think they had a nanny, and they took her kids, and she missed their childhood, and that bothers me. And one more thing, that really fascinates me, that I think might get missed because we live in 2025. She had to abase herself for this goodness to happen. I mean, I can't emphasize enough what a big deal it was to just open up your spleen and say, look at my flaws, look at my terrible marriage, look at my abuse, look at how I was that was so shameful back then. Everybody tried, it was Victoriana. Up until the 1960s, it was shameful. Mm-hmm. You put on your best face and you pretended everything was peachy keen. And she said, no, everything's crappy because of nothing I did, and it has to change. And she took one for the team, in my opinion.
On that front,
she was willing to.
On that front, your book is about the forgotten sluts and shrews that shaped America. So when you think about impact and Elizabeth Packard and the way she shaped America, is it that during the trial and during her advocacy, it opened the doors to what was happening behind closed doors? Or is it more the sort of laws she advocated for? Was it a social impact, or was it more of a political, legal impact?
The reason people stopped over, just like today with clickbait, they didn't have that back then, but the reason people read more than the headline was because it was a little bit juicy. If it had been if it had just been bare facts, and she hadn't put her humanity into it and said, I have feelings. Yeah. Women couldn't vote, but they were influential. Mm-hmm. They did a lot of stuff besides voting. And they would stop and see that, and they'd read it, and they'd feel it. And if it had just been bare facts, it wouldn't have been influential at all, because most men men like bare facts, and they would have ignored it. And women like to hear about the humanity behind the story. And she infused this whole terrible incident, which if told in a different light would be quite dry and quite straightforward. She's like, no, it was messy and it hurt. So it was a mixture of both.
One of the things that I love about this story too is, this is not someone I think most of us had heard a ton about before this, but she has been in recent years been getting a lot more attention. There was a book that came out about her called "The Woman They Could Not Silence."
I got mad.
But also Governor J.B. Pritzker, because she is kind of this Illinois institution at this point. Governor J.B. Pritzker renamed the mental health hospital in Springfield, Illinois, after her, and I think that's such a lovely tribute.
It's actually an institution now.
Yeah. That's pretty cool to have the name changed. Yeah. And a lot of times we don't realize sort of the legacy that we all live our lives in has been built off the struggles and hardship and really oppression of a lot of other people. And so to be able to put a name and a face to someone like her.
And she wasn't afraid to let you know.
Well, look, we should say that this Elizabeth Packard story is just one of a number that you cover in your book. You get into Mary Edwards Walker, Lillian Gilbreth, Ida B. Wells. A bunch of these names are ones that have come up in our show over the years. But listeners, go check out that book. It is called Unbecoming a Lady, The Forgotten Sluts and Shrews That Shaped America. Teresa, you've also written a couple other books, Unmentionable and Ungovernable. We'll put links to all those in our show notes. But Teresa, thank you so much for doing this. This has been great, and thanks for highlighting people like Elizabeth.
Oh, you guys have the coolest podcast.
Well, it's an audio equivalent of what you kind of do, so it's great.
Best.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. You guys have an incredible podcast focusing on things that need to not be forgotten. Yes, we do that in common. The forgotten parts of history are often the most interesting and delicious, and you dig them up and brush them off and spit shine them, and you say, look at this, you guys, look what I found. And I'm so proud to have been a part of that today.
Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.